Call the meeting to order in capacity as the Deputy Village Clerk. So with that, I will call the roll. Trustee Briand.
Here.
Trustee Ankerman.
Here.
Trustee Fisher.
Here.
Trustee Marquis.
Here.
Trustee Ryder.
Here.
In the absence of President Charlo, would someone want to make a motion to nominate a member of the board as President Pro Tem?
I'll make that nomination. I'll nominate Trustee Ankerman.
Is there a second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Well, I'm here, I'll also briefly call the roll for the PCZBA, if that's all right.
Please.
Chair Peters? Member Danley? Member Fisher? Member Miller? Here. Member Russell?
Present.
Member Sorensen? Here. And Member Toll? Here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This begins the Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals meeting with the Board of Trustees. It's Wednesday, September 22nd. We've called roll, and at this time, if there are any non-agenda items or visitors, whether in person or online, for those who would like to address these two boards for items that are not on the agenda, we would ask participants to limit their comments to a maximum of 5 minutes. Is there anyone, not seeing anyone in the room, but is there anyone online perhaps?
Are you seeing anyone? I'm not on.
Two individuals are present, but neither has requested to be recognized.
Okay, if someone would like to speak, you can raise your hand in the next moment or so, but if we don't hear from anyone, then we will go ahead and move ahead with the next agenda item, which is the discussion about planned residential development regulations and have a zoning district review workshop. And I understand that we have some TSCA information to share, and we have a member of TSCA here. Drew, do you want to tee up an introduction?
Sure. As most everyone was here at the last workshop and the first workshop regarding the village's examination and review of its planned residential development regulations and those areas in the community where, which might be subject to those various zoning districts. The village has identified this as a critical issue to examine. And sorry about that. And the village has brought on some professional planning and zoning expertise from Teskin Associates, a consulting firm that the village has utilized over the years for various projects. And Michael Blue is here tonight to pick up where we left off from the last conversation. He has provided an assessment of the village's planned residential development regulations that went out in the packet last week. Hopefully everybody has a chance to review that. A number of recommendations and best practices part of that, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael to do his presentation.
Thank you, Drew. Madam President Pro Tem, members of PCZBA, Village Board. It's nice to see you all again. You'll tell me if you can hear me or not. I never know if I'm loud enough or shouting at you with this thing on, so I'll apologize for that now, but you'll let me know. So what I'd like to do is, if we can go to the first slide, Glenn, just let you know what we're up to tonight. And we did send this around to you this afternoon, just in the thought that maybe you could get a peek at it beforehand. It was not essential homework. Apologize for it getting to you so soon before, but we thought, I put this together and thought, this would help if people could see it. If you've not had a chance to look at it, it's certainly not a problem. We'll take a quick look at the process in terms of where we're at and where we're going. And then we have a few primary findings. Again, there's a lot of detail in the report, but we have a few primary findings that I want to summarize with you. And then we want to discuss some of the recommendations that are in here. The recommendations that we're going to discuss, and I'll just say this from the beginning, are the ones that are policy-based. And we talked a little bit when I was here last time about the point of zoning and the value of zoning. The whole idea is to accomplish the development that the village wants to see. And the fundamental question of zoning is the zoning ordinance helping the village get the development that it wants to see? And that's what we're trying to do. We are not yet to the gory details of how many copies of things need to be submitted or what exactly needs to be submitted. We're still up here. So if there's a number in here that you looked at and you went, oh my gosh, no, or anything like that, we're not to the numbers yet. That'll be the next time we get together. But I want you all to be kind of a mindset to think in terms of policy. Are we, in terms of the recommendations, are these things that are going to get us to where we want to be? Fair enough? Great. Let's go to the next slide and talk about where we are. It's easy enough to tell. We're in phase 5, obviously. But what I've been doing since I saw you last was talking to a number of stakeholders, folks who've been through the zoning process, folks who do development in town, folks who have done a couple of developments in town or a lot of development in town, just to get a sense of how the ordinance works. Talked to some folks who shared ideas about what might work better, what could be changed, so on and so forth. All that led to, that's sort of the big picture, that's more to create wisdom and background. The real guts of what's been going on since I saw you last is this assessment, which was that 13-page zoning memo, which I know was just enthralling to read. I know it's a real page turner when you read zoning. But there's a lot of detail, and zoning is detailed stuff. And so I was shooting for 6 pages. I swear to you I was. But there's a lot of detail. And frankly, the more we went over it with staff, the more we talked about it, the more things came up, and they're in there. And I hope that if by the end of tonight we can get to consensus on the policy recommendations that are in there, we'll be in a really good position to move on to phase 6, which is to start to draft the ordinance, and then come back to you with that version of the ordinance that's got the numbers that we're going to look at really closely. So let's start with some of the broader findings. Remember last time we were here, I asked you what may have seemed like a lot of annoying questions about what do we want Lake Bluff to be? What is the essential Lake Bluff? How do you characterize Lake Bluff? Where do you take your friends when they come to visit? That sort of thing. The reason for that was evident in the read of it, but became more apparent as we talked to stakeholders who said, you know, there's really nothing in the code that conveys what is unique and special about Lake Bluff that the developer ought to know. And I talked to people who said, you know, folks coming here to do a development, they don't know anything about town. And that's kind of why it doesn't go well, is because they try and bring some other type of development to town. Not unusual, not unexpected. And while the zoning ordinance is not going to specifically say do this, do that in terms of the character, although it could, the purpose statement is the point at which to provide a little more bit of explanation about who the village is and the type of development the village wants to see. So there's really no clear picture in the code of expectations for development. And I use the word picture very specifically because when we do this, we can use pictures and graphics and include them in the ordinance to give people a better idea. So when they come before you, even before they come before either of your bodies, they've got an idea of what they're up to. This is common in codes, in modern codes. The permitted uses are logical, but again, not really specific enough. And the use of the term multifamily in there is really vague. So if a developer thinks, oh, I could do multifamily, there's really not enough direction in there to tell them what multifamily means. And in the world of development, multifamily can be thought of as anything from a duplex to a condo building. So there needs to be a little bit more focus on that. Glenn, will you take the next slide, please? The standards, the regulations for development that are in the PRD are very specific, almost like it's a zoning district. And it's not meant to be a zoning district. It's meant to be an overlay district. It's meant to be like a big special use. If you think of it that way, you're ahead of the game. And the regulations that are in there don't really do that yet. In that regard, it creates, that's where some of this confusion comes from. There are some things that are in there that need to be reviewed in terms of the size of the PRD, density calculations, height, open space, those are in the recommendations. And then there are some things that are commonly found that are best practices in development codes that are not in here that we'd like to see you add. And they're listed up here: distances between buildings, issues about sustainability, public benefit, and so on. In terms of the process, I think I would describe the process currently as being a little bit backloaded. A lot of the standards for review are at final determination. The detailed consideration comes towards the end. You have people, the code is set up such that a potential developer can get pretty far into the process without having clear feedback from the community, from the commission, from the board, in terms of really whether or not, how they're doing, if nothing else. And so that's actually a pretty easy fix. So again, very high level. The code, the way it's set up now, doesn't reflect modern best practices. The findings kind of detail that. If anybody has any questions about the findings side of it, or how we looked at it, I'm more than happy to answer those now. If not, we can dive into the recommendations.
I was just curious, when you talk to stakeholders, what that entailed, what kind of stakeholders you spoke to in the community? Can you give a little more detail on that?
If I remembered, yeah, it's in my notes. We talked to folks who had done development in town, so folks that were developers that had been through zoning processes with the village. I honestly don't remember exactly. Drew, help. It was. I would tell you, it was a great list, and the feedback was terrific. We talked to people who knew the area. We talked to some architects who work in town.
Okay.
We talked to
builders who work in town.
Talk to builders who work in town.
Talk to, I would say, longtime residents who've been intimately involved with zoning procedures and processes in town.
Well said, thank you.
You've been involved, who else did you speak? I think you spoke with other developers and builders who may not have worked in town, but have worked on the North Shore.
Right.
And I think you talked to other zoning officials in nearby North Shore communities who were.
Yeah. And I don't want to spill any names, and we can.
No.
Yeah.
I just was wondering what
I would tell you, it was folks that are very much from the practical side of things, right? So I took our workshop. I take this group as the policy side, but that was very much a practical group. That's why it was a group of architects and such.
Thanks.
Thanks, Drew.
Could I ask a follow-up? Did you ever talk to any past members of the PCCBA for their reflections on what it was like for them to?
We
visit
talked to
this
some
first?
folks who'd been on the commission, yeah. Okay, let's dive in. And the structure that we followed, again, was the same four main sections that are in the current PRD. And whether or not it ends up specifically like that, I'm not entirely sure. It might be close, but once you get into final drafting, things move around is all I can tell you. So these are questions for you. What I essentially did was I took the recommendations and I put question marks after them, because these are policy questions. These go to these questions, as I said before, is this right for Lake Bluff? So in terms of the types of uses that are appropriate in a PRD, like we said, the PRD says multifamily. And multifamily, as I said, is this range from a couple of attached single-family units all the way to apartments and condos. What I took from our policy discussion and a workshop is that a condo apartment type development is not necessarily what the village wants to see or consider as part of its PRD, and that perhaps row homes are the right kind of development format. So with that, I ask you, is that close?
I actually noticed that throughout this report, when I reviewed it, that row homes kept coming up, and page 3, or maybe it's 4 said, you said specifically, and the recommendation, and not have flat over flat multifamily dwellings. So row homes, yes, condos, no. However, flat over flat condos is how I read that. However, what we've heard again and again, my short time on the board and before that on the PCZBA, is we need homes that older folks will move into. And row homes are up and down. So are we putting elevators in the row homes? Or are we, I thought one thing that I'd learned is that we need some options for multifamily homes for older folks who are empty nesters to move into, and that would be single-story homes ideally. No?
I echo that. When I read it, I specifically thought the same thing, and I think the language that I was given that would describe that most accurately is age-targeted design, so that we want to encourage that type of design and development so that there's more than, I have a single-family home with a big yard that I have to mow, and I now need to go to assisted living because I can't do anything anymore. There's a big range, and we don't aim to solve everyone's problem, but we would really like to have more options available. And specifically, when my older parents moved to town, they had to find a place in Lake Forest that had a garage and an elevator and one level and a patio on the ground floor and, all these things, and it's allowed them to be there. And, that's my story, and everybody's story is different, but I think that we all are gonna get older unless we die, so we'd all like to accommodate such things. And I think it behooves all of us to kind of encourage that in some fashion by the words that we use and the things that we do.
We can have a combination. We can have a combination of all these things, right? I mean, we could permit condos and apartment dwellings and row homes, correct? And then depending on what the developer brings to us, we could say, oh yeah, that's something that we're interested in. So we could make it broader rather than more limited. We can do something like that. Not necessarily that we're going to put up a lot of row homes, but at least we would have the option if someone wanted to. My parents are in the city, they live in a row home, and they're almost 80. So I know I mean, they're pretty spry. I know it's doable, and they're not leaving there anytime soon, hopefully. So I guess I feel like the more we can allow, the better, right? If we can put more options in there, then that's the way I would look at it.
I think the thing I was most concerned about is we kind of all talk about like pie in the sky, what do we want to do, and what are big broad brush goals that we want to accomplish, but unless we not only just define, but incentivize certain types of development. And so, I mean, in my opinion, I'm not excluding things, but I want to incentivize these pie in the sky things that seem kind of like unattainable vapors in Lake Bluff to have something actually happen. It's happened elsewhere. What can we do to make it really happen in Lake Bluff?
So for pie in the sky, let me poke at that a little bit. The
Okay.
idea that the code in the village might incentivize, say, universal design or age-oriented development that,
Right.
looks is built more for seniors. That might be something that was enough of an interest to the village. And I'm not recommending, I'm just outlining and looking for people to either nod, or you can't see anybody smile, but that would be something that that the village would want to incentivize. And we'll talk a little bit later about what those incentives are, but is that along the lines of what you're thinking?
That's along the lines of what I'm thinking,
Okay.
but I don't know. I'd like to hear what other members.
I had a question. The last time we got together, we were talking about the minimum acreage, which still is 6. So would this be predicated on a change?
Well, we're not going to, as my understanding, we're not going to address exact numbers at this point, or?
Right, I understand
Yeah.
that, but if it's, I realize that, but is this a little bit of cart before the horse if we're talking about condos and row houses, if we haven't established, I mean, we're talking about multifamily housing.
And we're.
I doubt that would be on 42 acres.
Right, but we're not necessarily talking about an entire 10, 20, 30, 40 acres being entirely multifamily. As you said, it might be a mix of it might be a mix of housing types. So you might have a single-family section,
Right.
some row
Like
homes.
Helmscott Park or the Glen.
Yeah, exactly.
The Glen would be the best example, I think, where you have that entire mix on a really large scale, which we don't have that kind of acreage, but we have something.
No, but you can
We have
shrink
something
that,
pretty,
you can shrink
close
that
for us.
concept down. And as a former Highland Park employee, I always think in terms of Fort Sheridan, right? Which has got a mix of those different kinds of things. And, oh yeah, there's that mid-rise building that's
Right.
there. So, but again, yeah, and that doesn't have to be the 70, 100 acres. You can have that same kind of mix on a smaller development parcel.
right, but I just am putting that out there because, this the 6 acres is there for a reason. So I realize we're not
6
getting bogged down in that, but still, it's in there right now.
Well, and 6 acres picks up what was in there now, and we'll talk later about whether or not we want to change that or how those impacts might be.
Right.
I would like to follow on the comment from Trustee Unconman, if I can.
Yes, please go ahead, Regis.
You can hear me well, Barb?
Yes, yes.
Thank you. Now, following on your comment, Barb, I believe this concern from people downsizing current homes and moving into a home that might be more appropriate following age is important to the village of Lake Bluff. This is probably the comment I have heard the most for people willing to change a dwelling in Lake Bluff. And so I think your comments were extremely important, Barb. Thank you.
Thank you.
That's what 2 a.m. in France sounds like.
We're glad you can join us
Lot of
virtually,
coffee.
Regis.
I can think. Thank you very much.
Can I add something? I
Yes.
thought, just going back, there was a previous plan for the Stonebridge property that, this is years ago, a different time, different circumstances, but even, the idea, Michael, of, row homes, condo, a diversity of housing product types. I don't know if you throw cottages in that mix as a different, versus a traditional single-family home, but smaller cottages, kind of a nod back to the village's history and what makes a lot of the east side properties so interesting visually, just because, the different lot sizes and that mix of lot size and scale has provided visual interest over the years. I think that was another product type that seemed to have legs in
And
the past.
duplexes like Armor Woods.
Correct, yep. And even the idea, and we've talked about this at the staff level with Michael, was the idea that of having subdivisions that, what if those were designed, a subdivision was designed that had the product types intermingled? So you'd have a large, like a larger home next to a smaller duplex, maybe next to a cottage next to, kind of like the east side looks like, think of certain blocks of East Prospect. That's what makes it so interesting visually and,
The North Terrace is like that.
The North
too, I
Terraces
think,
too,
don't you
right?
think so?
There is diversity of housing types built in different eras, right? That's what makes it very interesting.
In general, the language in that first section was, I guess, perhaps intentionally vague, and the addition of specifically defined row homes, condos, apartments, et cetera, cottages. I don't know if that is the thing that somehow makes a developer show up who wouldn't have otherwise shown up, or a plan show up that wouldn't have otherwise shown up. In some ways, I think it's a great idea, but in other ways, I think, is the laundry list helpful in terms of something now is going to happen that wouldn't have happened otherwise? And then if we create this laundry list, and then, in 10 years, there's always some new, like whoever knew that there would be Airbnb, nobody knew about that X number of years ago. And so I guess I'm just going to push back and say, I love all the ideas and I love all the diversity and all that, but is adding that language accomplishing the goal of now we're helping future developers actually, I didn't even think of that before, is that what that's really doing? And the images, I'm also concerned that, well, we have to pick an image of something somewhere somehow, and then are we really planting the right seed? And why did we choose this image as opposed to that image? Are you having too heavy a hand in, because I love the idea that we can see something that we were not able to even think of. Sure. And somebody's going to come forth and go, ta-da. So I just hope that we're not actually, if anything, having the unintended consequence of something else.
I think I would offer another way to think about it. I think the conversation is going in a really good direction. Part of this question is, if somebody showed up with a development that included a mid-rise condo or apartment dwelling, would the reaction to that be, oh, this is something we need, this is good, let's consider how this fits in and decide if it's appropriate? Or would the reaction be, no way, not in my town, never?
So when
Which
you-
I have heard from communities.
Yeah, and I don't know what mid-rise means.
Sure it is.
And what is the word mid-rise? Is, are we have like height restrictions kind of already in there. And so when you say mid-rise, does that mean that it's already by definition above and beyond what the existing height requirement
Let's say
is?
it's 4 stories, because 4 stories is a break point of construction and for a lot of development these days. So let's think in terms of 4 stories.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be something that we'd be open to, or something that we would just react negatively to?
I think we've already crossed that bridge.
Well-
I think it depends on where it is. I mean, right here, that's
And
already been dealt
you're
with.
quite right. The answer is always, it depends where it is, how does it fit in, and how does it reflect the standards
We
of
were
the code.
talking about like.
Absolutely.
Reimagining the business park. I'm a proponent of putting a hotel out there. If it's 6 stories tall, I don't see anybody going, oh, that's too much. It wouldn't be logical, but.
Context is everything. I couldn't-
Context is everything. We're not Highland Park or Wilmette that have built these very tall buildings as of late.
Right.
Or even Winnetka, which was going to do that at Winnetka 1. So it's just a different,
Yeah.
this is so claustrophobic, relatively speaking. We don't have these large spaces to make a mid-rise building
Very true.
feel correct. And in the last meeting, you asked us on the, things, and the first thing is that we don't have a canyon effect, which other communities now have because they've gone up. But they can because they have, Libertyville's 35 square miles. It's an enormous community, so you can put that there and it
Right.
makes sense. I just don't,
And yet the height of a multifamily building in the downtown is still a very controversial discussion in
for
Libertyville.
sure, I'm sure it is, because it's out of sync with what that has been for, at least in my recollection, the last 50 years. So it has to have some, there has to be some synchronicity,
Right.
otherwise it just is disjointed.
Yeah, I'd like at this time to invite the PCZBA members. This is a joint meeting, and we've been monopolizing, so heard a lot about what I think, so I think it's time for me to.
I'll make a quick comment. Barbara, I think your comments were spot on about the intent of the original language being purposely vague, because we are not developers. The village is not developers. We're not the creative minds to create these projects. So I think we were wanting to invite flexibility, invite new ideas, creative ideas that maybe we weren't thinking. But we've tried that, right?
Yeah.
We've been working with this document for many years now, and perhaps it's time to become more prescriptive. To incentivize would be great. I think we've tried to do that as well. But perhaps we just need to give more guidance on the front end in order to get what we need on the back end.
Thank you, Member Toll. Any other PCZBA members want to weigh in?
Well, I concur with your points about the need that has been expressed over and over and over for years for accessibility as well as a universal design for people to be able to age in place. So, honestly, I looked at the row homes and I did the same thing. I toyed with that in my mind to keep staying with row homes, and then the creative part said, well, it could look like a row home but still be a single level. And there's an elevator access. I mean, some of it does come down to how it's presented and what it looks like. And cottages, though, are another nice idea. I think, frankly, we've all probably stayed in really well done Airbnb where it's laid out so well because it's designed so well, and it occurs to you that maybe you could actually live with a lot less space than you already have. So I think that we need to keep the designs, or I think we need to keep the, we want to tighten up the plans because they have been gracious and generous but not provided enough guidance. But there is still room for creativity.
So am I hearing that the addition of descriptive names such as row homes is acceptable, condos, is that acceptable, apartments, is that acceptable? I mean, I think the question we're being asked, is there anything that people just go,
Well, what if we did something like included but not limited to? That's a common thing that we do in drafting, and it just, that way it isn't just this,
and,
you know, these people get it. I mean,
Right.
there's sort of a universal aspect to multifamily dwelling, but if we said what Michael put up here, I think duplexes are a must, because we all know Armor Woods is a huge success. And that hits somebody at a different place in their life than a condo. Because I have clients out there, they want a yard, they want all that. So we might not want to dissuade somebody, especially if we're trying to target a specific age range, which I think is very wise. Plus, that would work beautifully with single-family homes. The segue is nice. So I would, from a drafting perspective, I think it would be wise to not hem ourselves in, but do including but not limited to. And that way you can do what you're talking about. If you open it up, but you're not closing any doors.
we're not trying to make an exhaustive list.
Correct, yeah, exactly.
Anyone else from the PCCBA? Okay, maybe we've gone too far on point number 1.
But no, it's an important point, because, overall density, and so let me do what zoning does, is let me complicate this further, right? Which is to say that, in terms of what the use list will say, is the use list will allow, and the term of art is just gonna be multifamily. Because condo, apartment, that's all ownership. That's not a zoning term, right? That's ownership. So it'll talk about multifamily, but there will be some caveats on it, right? It'll talk about how tall it is. It may talk about, it's zoning, we can cook up whatever Peter tells me I can do. It might be limited by other factors in terms of the minimum size of the PUD or the PRD that we're working with, right? So to your point, in a 6 acre PRD, that might be kind of a tight squeeze. Maybe you have to have 10 or 15 acres, right? To where a 4-story building is not looming on people, right? So, and I'm going to stop doing this now because I'm just making this up off the top of my head, but what's going to come back to you is going to be this notion that multifamily is acceptable in the appropriate circumstances. And staff and I will work on what those appropriate circumstances are, and we'll come back to you and look for that. Is that appropriate and in keeping with the consensus of the group?
Yes.
I'm hearing lots of nodded yeses. And we didn't talk about the Rio District aspect of your,
A little more technical than policy-oriented, but the idea was that the current code lists a number of non-residential types of uses, and the idea is that, well, if you've got a non-residential portion of it, that it could be regulated by the RIO standards, and there really isn't need to infuse the PRD with that.
so it's just kind of carving out that it's okay to do that, this is separate. and
That's-
We can have that little Rio District surrounded by.
Yeah, and that's in fact, we talked with that with staff, and administratively that works, and for
Yeah.
a matter of policy, I think it would be kind of seamless. You would consider it as the same development. It's not like you do all the residential part and then come back for the RIO aspect of the development. You would do it all at once.
I see.
So it's a little more technical than maybe others, but just wanted to be sure that nobody was opposed to the notion.
Regis, did you have any comments?
No, I think the comment stands, that is, what do we want to see? Where do we want to orient the policy to basically satisfy the people living in the village and their future? I think it is important to keep in mind that many people are asking for, how can I continue to live in the village? And that's the comment I've heard the most. And so my question to the board and to the PCCBA is, how can we satisfy what our residents are asking for through this policy, this set of policies?
And I think that we can make that part of the follow-up discussion when the when the use list with the appropriate or with some suggested limitations or parameters comes back to you.
That sounds good.
Okay, let's go to the next slide and talk about the standards that are related to the PRD. And I would reiterate again, the way the PRD is set up now, there's a lot of numbers in it. There's not a lot of context for them. In the PRD district, the numbers ought to be thought of as either a maximum or a starting point. Keep in mind, the PRD, it's a planned development, it's a special use, it's the sort of thing that goes through a process. So these are places to start. But let's start with 1, 2, and 3, which are kind of a group. And trustee goes back to your point about, okay, why 6? All right. And 6 was a place to start the discussion because 6 is in the current code. It requires that a PRD be at least 6 acres unless the village board makes certain findings that would be appropriate to consider smaller. What's suggested here is that everything over 6 or some other number that we pick would have to go through the PRD process. The thing about having to go through the PRD process, and that chart that is in the report is really the key to that. There's a higher level of review, there's more discussion, there's more input, there's more public input as part of the PRD. So the idea is to say, all right, at what point do we want that level of feedback from the community, that level of discussion at the PCZBA and ultimately at the board. And so again, the idea is that developments that are large, whatever large is defined as, because they're going to have an impact on adjacent properties, developments that have a certain type of use, and you see I put the row home thing in here, again, thinking that we were going to focus on row homes rather than multifamily. Certainly not a problem to change, but we might, for instance, say, you know what, any development, even if it's under 6 acres, that's got some sort of multifamily is going to be a PRD because it's going to have more of an impact, it's going to be more different, it's going to change things. We definitely want to look at that, right? So the options here are what has to be a PRD and what may be considered as a PRD. And you'll recall at the last meeting, staff had provided a great graphic that showed that there were not a ton of properties that were 6 acres and over. So there are only a few opportunities where this would be a requirement, which is fine. If you've got a development that's smaller, that can either be located in certain areas, that can have certain types of development in it. Like I said, I think having multifamily as part of your residential development might throw you into the PRD, just at that higher level of review. Those are all on the table for discussion.
Well, I think even though I read this several times over and I listened to the comments regarding that number 6 for when it's to be considered for a PRD, just hearing you say that the difference is it has to have a PRD over fill in the blank variable and it may have a PRD. The part where it may be to everyone's advantage to have the PRD because then we can accomplish all of those things that you can't accomplish if there isn't a PRD. So if you look at it all as being able to accomplish things and not here's a magic number that somebody put in place so that these people can be excluded. No, it's this needs to have it and these below may.
Right.
And because it may, we can then accomplish these larger goals.
And what you'll find is the mays apply to developments that if they tried to do a traditional subdivision or traditional by right development would require so much relief and so many variations and so much that it's ridiculous to have them come to you and ask for a list of variations this long. You're going to say no. Any development that needs a list of variations this long, there's something wrong with it. But it may well be a good idea, and to think of it in terms of a PRD where the list of variations are traded for the incentives and the benefits that we've got in here, well, that might be something that the village is willing to entertain. So that's, again, I appreciate the way you described it. There's the musts and there's the should be's and or the could be's.
Right.
And the could be's will generally be situations that are to common benefit.
Right, right. Any comments? from the
And we,
board.
I'm sorry to interrupt, we don't have to pick the numbers tonight.
No, and I don't, but I just mean, you know, visceral reactions to,
Do we know the history behind the choice of 6?
Drew, do you know any history on that?
I mean,
magic
George, do
number?
you know?
What's the question?
George, do you know if the 6 acres number is arbitrary, or was what the rationale behind 6 was?
It's been there before 1989.
Yeah, and I think the answer is when the village was entertaining a development called Tangley Oaks. The developer came through and laid out, well, these regulations will get me where I'm going. And that's how it was.
And that's the genesis of this?
Yes.
There is no magic in it. There is no requirement to stick with it. From my perspective, I left it in because I sort of liked the idea that there's at least a few properties that are going to be over that are going to be impactful. A development under 6, you know, may or may not be as impactful as Tangley Oaks or Stonebridge, certainly. But it's a size. And you know what we can do, and Drew and Glenn, maybe we can take a look, if we set the number at 4 or 5 or 3, or, you know, what might that trigger in terms of properties that are held?
First of properties, yeah.
Right, and that could be a way for us to come back to you with a suggestion that says, if we set it at 3, for instance, you know, then we've got all of these properties that when they develop will absolutely have to be a PRD. And it's a great chance for, and I'll do this with staff before I ever bring it to you, and not to make you deal with too many of the details, but to say, yeah, you know what, this is the kind of one, if this developed, this would be a good one to consider as a PRD. So,
So can I please ask you what other communities are doing, such as Highland Park and maybe Wilmette or larger communities? What is their minimum size?
oh, it is absolutely all over the place. I see 10 acres a lot. I don't know why. I would guess honestly that somebody read somebody else's code and it said 10, so they picked 10, and then somebody else read it and they picked 10. Mr. President, I'm not trying to be smart about it, but there really is no magic. And I would put the most faith in that analysis I described, with an opportunity to work with staff to identify, yeah, you know what, every property, take a look at the properties over 3, over 4, over 5, and have you feel comfortable. It says, yeah, you know what, if these kind of ones come before us, we want to have a higher level of review. That would be a scientific way to do it rather than just picking numbers out of the air, which is how we got here and how, unfortunately, a lot of communities do it.
Yep, I also trust that process fitting best our community. Thank you.
Member Miller?
Yeah, instead of thinking in terms of acreage, which is very limited in Lake Bluff, what if we thought about terms of how many homes on a lot, and make that our standard? So anything beyond 2 homes or 1 home should be considered a PRD rather than
Agreed.
the acreage piece, since that seems rather arbitrary.
Well, that's kind of like the number 3 require row home developments, or it doesn't have to be row home, anything that has 10 or more units. So, you know, something along that lines, yeah.
So, and the PCZBA, we've gone through lots where they wanted to put another home. Most recently, we had that workshop. I think the term PRD came up.
Mm-hmm.
Was that the C district, or what was it? Was it zone, the one on?
Was that Shore Acres property? It was
No,
that,
the one about
Yeah, that was off of Westwood, that was in the estate district.
the state district. We considered it somewhat like a PRD by adding an accessory dwelling. So we're mixing up different things that the PCZBA was working on ADUs, which are small pieces. But this goes beyond that. This is an actual home on a single piece of property. And I'm just wondering, maybe two homes on a property becomes a PRD, or 3 homes on a property becomes a PRD.
I would agree, and it's a best practice that a lot of communities use, because what's happening is the fundamental underlying zoning is sort of being taken off the table at that point. If you could just turn it into 2 lots and subdivide it, that would probably happen. But if there's a reason or a desire for somebody to put 2 homes on 1 lot, then yeah, the PRD is a logical thing to do. Sometimes in terms of ownership, There's lots of reasons to do it, but since you're stepping away from the normal course of underlying zoning, it's perfectly reasonable to have the two lots trigger the PRD. I agree.
To me, it makes more sense than an arbitrary 6 acres. There aren't any 6-acre lots. I mean, there aren't that many. Certainly the ones we have here are larger than 6 acres.
But I would suggest to you, even if we pick a number that's 3 or 4 or whatever, I would add the more than one unit as a PRD as well. We could certainly do that if the group.
Would the population of what needs to get churned through staff and legal and all that be too burdensome? I mean, or it just sounds like a lot. I'm not saying I don't want to have review or control. I'm just saying, what are the practical ramifications of such a thing?
I think the first question that was asked about looking at properties that, 3, 4, 5, those types of numbers, that's not that difficult an exercise to do with GIS. And then just the number saying, this number of units, I think we can go back and look at other codes and other best practices to try and what's the magic number and maybe, tinker around. I think it's not burdensome.
Okay.
What you're effectively doing, based on your question, is you're kind of discouraging people from putting 2 homes on one lot. It's not.
Right.
It's not what you want to do. We have the
Not what we wanna
underlying
do
zoning.
anyway, right.
It's there to have side yards. It's there to
Right.
create the predictability of the side yard and the front yard and so on. If somebody wants to add a unit to a lot or do 2 on a lot, there's something unique going on here. And that's sort of the price of doing something unique, is to go through a process that has a higher level of review, involves the community,
Right.
asks the neighbors what's going on. So it's commonly done, and I agree that it would be something we could add to this.
And going back to your proposals here and the guidelines, we have the pre-visit. Like, I mean, we do that at the PCZ, we have the workshops. And we had one recently, this home in Witchwood. And it turned out that most of the members did not agree with the homeowner. And it was taken off the table. So they didn't go through a huge expense up front to get a negative review.
Right, so you're saying that the preliminary workshop was
Is very
effective
important.
in saying, is this a go, is this a no-go? How much do I invest in terms of time and fees and et cetera, before I get really upset that you're
Correct.
just gonna say no?
Yes. And that worked out very well, I think.
And I talk to developers all the time. They all appreciate that no. They all
Right.
appreciate hearing early in the process
Right.
that this is not going to work. Thank you. I'm leaving before I spend $100,000 to be told no.
Right,
Can I just ask, so then, let's say that we have an 8-acre property in town that is, so if we have, let's say, an 8-acre property in town that has a main house and it has a couple older outbuildings, which we've got at least one that I can think of, if not maybe more. So if that homeowner just wants to sell to another homeowner, they're not planning any of this, does any of this kick in any way, shape, or form, or is it just, it would not have any?
Well, only if they were looking to develop the property, any other real estate transaction this should
They
not
were-
enter in, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. If they were looking to subdivide it or,
Yeah.
yeah.
It may make them think in that direction, but
Right.
wouldn't impact, per
Yeah.
se.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
I'm looking at Highland Park in Elliott, they do kind of that hybrid thing where they break it down, so it's 10 or more dwellings in a single-family residential district, et cetera. They parse it out. To pick up your point, which is good, I think we do a numerical approach and an acreage approach. So it's an interesting approach to take the way that they do it, assuming I'm in the right. I know I'm in the right church.
It sounds
I'm not sure
familiar,
if I'm
so
in
I
the
think
right
you are,
pew.
yeah.
I think I'm in the right pew. But it's kind of a nice way to do it because it addresses, if it's a townhouse development consisting of, for example, 3 or more dwelling units on any single-family residential district, or if it's this, or if it's this. So it's really specific.
right.
But it lets, to your point, it lets potential developers know. And I'm not sure being vague is helpful. It certainly doesn't feel like it has been of late. So being specific is fine, and then we're saying what we don't want to. I mean, there's no harm in doing that. I don't think we need to,
Absolutely.
like, as you said, why lay out the welcome mat with no direction, and then somebody gets pretty far down the road and says, if only I'd known.
I agree
So
completely.
if we come to the conclusion that a specific type of housing is just not something that's gonna work here, okay, we're only 4 square miles. There's only so much we can accomplish in that little amount of space, given the few acres that we have to work with that are open.
You're thinking about it spot on, and just for everybody else, I would just add, think of this, at what point are we concerned that there's enough potential impact on the community, on the neighbors, on the neighborhood, that we want to take a closer look? Or that we just want to say no? That's kind of what this is about, right? At what point do we go, hold on a minute, let's take a look? And below that, the PRD maybe is not required.
Is there a way to, or should we think in terms of based on the size of the lot or the district, that if somebody wants to add something in the R1 district, second home, they would certainly have to be a PRD. But if somebody wants to add a second or third home in the CE district, the country estate district, maybe there'll be more leeway in that because the acreage is so big.
Let's think about that. So that the thresholds would differ by district potentially.
Correct. As long as it meets the underlying zoning.
Okay. So again, from this point, what we'll do is I'll get with staff, we'll try and do that analysis that we described in terms of what properties, and we'll take a shot jointly at what maybe is the right threshold, and we'll share all that with you and get your feedback on that.
There were some also some real numbers in here. Do we want to gloss over that, or do we want to talk about that? I mean, certainly height and buffers, and those are yeah.
They're up
I
here.
saw
Let's
that.
do those next.
Yeah.
So let's start with density, the overall number of units. This is always an issue. This is always controversial. This is always a big question. The recommendation that's in here is to define a rather straightforward way of calculating what the density is going to be. There's no need for it to be complicated. The recommendation that's in here, something we talked with staff about, that I completely support, is this idea that it's essentially a math problem. It's a word problem, right? And that it's different for each zoning district based on the size of the lots, right? And so it's just dividing the size of the lots into the acres you have, and that's how many units you can have. Whether or not you cluster them, put them in row homes, stack them on top of each other, that's how many you can have, right? And the upside to that, so to speak, is that there is a level of confidence and understanding on the part of the community that there's not going to be any more units which generate traffic and noise and people and students and all that sort of stuff than there could be under the underlying zoning. How it's structured becomes the function of the PRD process and the standards that will be in it. That's kind of the upside. That's the value of that approach. It's straightforward and it's consistent with the rights that exist currently for any of these given properties. The question that you get to, there's two things about that. One, it is not a guarantee, right? It doesn't mean you get that many units. If you can't, and we're kind of talking, just sort of the point you made, right? If you can't lay them out in such a way that is appropriate and meets the standards of the ordinance, you don't necessarily get the 40 units or whatever it turned out to be. The question that is worth considering is whether or not there's granting of some number above that. Right, so if this mathematical equation that I'm talking about says you can have 40 units, is there a circumstance under which the village might consider, well, yeah, you can go to 45, or let's say you get the base plus 10% if you show us this lovely development and you meet these standards that we've talked about. The other reason, and then I'll step back, the other reason that one might allow more units than the underlying density, underlying permitted density that I've described, is because you have met some incentive, and there's a few of these and a couple slides forward, that the village has set out. The one I'm intrigued with that I'm not sure how to do, it goes back to what Drew said, which is, if you create an environment that's got this mix of housing types, which is good for any number of reasons, then we can see a density bonus, right? If you're advancing a village goal or a village priority, there's bonuses to be had. If the farmhouse that's on the property is preserved because it's historic and it's part of the culture of the community and you're going to make it part of your development, then there's a bonus to be had. You can get an extra unit or an extra 2 units to market as part of the development. So there's kind of 3 questions here. Setting the density top, allowing there to be some reason for somebody to request more than that, and whether or not that going over that number is based on a specific incentive that's outlined in the code.
So, Michael, this is George Russell. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, George.
Go ahead, George.
I really think that this item number 4 here is the crux of the entire development problem in Lake Bluff and in many, many communities. Just as an example, Stonebridge has a base underlying zoning E1. And if you do the calculations as you suggest, and that you're suggesting we not even allow it to be varied, the number of permitted units only works out to be about 30, which if anybody knows the numbers right now at Stonebridge, the development approved in 2006, I believe permitted 77 units. When the current owner of the property came back in 2010, he was talking upwards of 100. So what the real issue is in some of our larger parcels that have the potential for redevelopment is that the base zoning is very low density zoning. And this this suggestion that we consider only allowing the total number of units based on the lot size of the current base zoning runs completely contrary to the interest of having smaller, more friendly homes, age-friendly homes for our older residents. And there's nothing that I see here in your 13 pages of text that we read through over the weekend that really gets at this issue of modifying the base zoning that is in place. And the subdivisions that I've witnessed over the years, 95% of the time at public meetings is spent in a debate over density. So that this issue is huge, and I don't think your suggestion that you've got written out here in your report is going to work at all, where we don't allow that to be varied. And then just as an aside, when you do your little table of permitted density over again, whoever cranked the math there, have them recheck their numbers, because 4 of the 6 calculations were not correct. The R3 district, based on your guidelines, would be 4.58 permitted dwellings instead of 3.63. There's some pretty substantial differences in the table there. I don't know how it was calculated, but it wasn't calculated based on what you described.
Okay,
But
well,
that's beside the point at this point.
Thank you for that. We'll go back and check that.
I think, well, it sounds like, Peter, you have something you wanted to chime in?
I was going to make a point, but George raises a good point too, which is a little bit what I was going to talk about too. George, I think as I read the report, the assumption was if somebody wanted X number of units and that was significantly above what the underlying zoning would allow, as part of the PRD, they would seek a rezoning to get more units. And what I was going to say was that the concern I would have about being too strict about that is, let's say, these numbers don't make any sense, but if R1, for example, would allow 30 units and R2 would allow 60 units, and somebody wants to put in 40 units, I don't like the idea of rezoning up to R2 because that entitles a lot more density than the person's even asking for. And if that person then, once you rezone it, it's rezoned forever or for a long time. So that's why I liked Michael's idea about there being some cushion in there so that if somebody has the ability to get more units without necessarily having to go all the way up to the next zoning district.
Well, and also isn't this idea of incentivizing the way that you get from what it is in the underlying zoning to something that you really, as a developer, want to get? So if I want to get from 30 to 40, I'm willing to create this public space. I'm willing to satisfy the goal of complete streets in this particular area. I'm willing to have public art. Whatever it is, and that's part of the process of going through the PRD, that the underlying zoning says this. I will ask for something more than that, and then this is part of your village stated goals. This is what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna have, 25% of it be, accessible for those who are trying to age in place, and I'm going, whatever it is, we have a lot of goals, and they're all good, and it's hard to accomplish all of them at once, and we're trying to do something different to start. And so these incentives, whatever they are, would hopefully help us get there.
I guess I just had a question. If we start offering incentives, so let's say a developer comes to us and says, okay, it's zoned for 30 units, but I would like 60, and now I've completed all these incentives. But as a board or the PCZBA says, well, we don't want 60, that's too much density. Do we have a recourse then if the developer actually completes the incentives? We're a little bit in that situation, I feel like.
So this is as much art as science, I'm sorry to say. But I would repeat something that we talked about earlier, which is that no matter how many units you're allowed, either by the underlying zoning, by a rezoning, which, yes, Peter, is kind of the intent that would have to be, but I agree with you that upzoning something that's going to be more than somebody proposes is probably not where we want to go. If the approach is to say you can have the base zoning plus 20%, 10%, whatever, right? That becomes an upside number. And my suggestion here is that we identify, and we can go back and redo this and rethink this, but we identify what an upside number as a starting point could be. But in no case is that an entitlement, right? So if that upside number becomes 50, you can have the 50 units if you can show that you have met the standards that relate to the planned development and the special use. You've always got to show those standards. If you overburden village utilities, if you create too much traffic, if you create a safety issue based on that traffic, if you're contrary to the comprehensive plan, if you don't meet the standards that are in the code, you don't get that absolute top number. But that's the process of meeting with you all and your recommendation to you and the feedback of the community and all that stuff that goes on. And there are an infinite number of ways to do this. None of them are tidy, I'm sorry to tell you. But what I would want us to strive for is something that's predictable, so that you all know kind of what the envelope is that you're working in, and that the residents know as well. If not, it just becomes an argument, and the people who want less, just because less is better, will always want less, and the people who want more, because more is more profit, will always want more. And that's not the basis to have an intelligent discussion about how many units there should be.
Yeah.
And honestly, that's kind of where the code is now.
Yeah.
And like I said, this is as much art as science. And if we can talk a little bit about how we'd like to do this, I'll have some suggestions and work with staff and council on it.
Is there anybody else from the PCZBA who has a comment to share? Aaron?
Sure. I guess I was originally a little bit confused about that particular note, the overall density based on underlying zoning, because it was my impression that we go through the PRD process in order to allow for a higher density than the underlying zoning. I mean, that's kind of what we've been working with for the last several years.
Well, not necessarily, though. I mean, you could say, I want to have this configuration of, if you added it all up, would allow that, but it's going to have this central space that's common and, you know, things that would violate, you know,
Other
right, but we
code
still
and
accomplish this
zoning
great
issues.
thing.
Okay, understood, yeah.
So, I mean,
So I guess there are.
it's not necessarily just that.
There are examples that.
Yeah.
That,
We haven't seen them, but we could.
right, right. So I guess higher density is one of the things that we
Yes.
use the PRD tool for. I do really like the idea of having a cap, an absolute cap saying whether it's the underlying, based on underlying zoning plus some percentage. I think that's really good. And only you get that percentage if you do these things. I think that's a great carrot. And a way to incentivize without freaking out the neighborhood, right? Because that's one of the big things that we're going through right now and have been for the last several years is that this density issue, our residents just don't know what the maximum possible is. And I think that's important to put in there. So that, and I would not want to rezone, upzone based on that. But I think giving an additional percentage on top of underlying zoning could be a good tool.
Would the next level of zoning for density be some, you know, obviously you would want a max that would be less than that, right? So if I'm going from X to X plus 1, right, then the incentive would have to be something less than upzoning. Incentive max. I would think.
Actually, I'm standing here thinking in terms of how we might craft, and I've seen this in a couple of places where you're kind of splitting the baby, where your allowance based on your underlying zoning does not take you all, to use Peter's example, which is spot on, is to not, you know, the potential for additional units doesn't take you all the way from R1 to R2,
Right.
but it takes you somewhere,
Right.
I don't know, is it halfway, is it 2/3 of the way, is it something, and that would be something that we could set up. But, you know, ultimately, and then you could still rezone, but you could rezone to a lower intensity district and then add that potential for more. But I would echo your thought. At some point, I think you'd be more comfortable if there was some top to it. And if the top is generous and it's got to be whittled down, whatever, but that's, in all those conversations I've seen about density being a concern, some parameters just would help.
I have a question about following what Aaron was talking about. That is, we have a base density, we have maybe criteria that are going to bring us to another 20%. So if a developer fits a community criteria, things that are good for the community, fine, we'll give another 20%. My question really is, when does the neighborhood come around? So we have a couple of examples in towns where developer did something or is thinking about a thing, but the community is not okay with it. And so when does the community aspect of the neighborhood aspect comes to grading the plus 20%, for example?
I think you've put your finger on the question we need to figure out and come back to you yet, is where how do we set that top with that? I mean, as you're suggesting, you know, perhaps 20% is a number, but I don't know that I can answer that standing here. It's a good question.
Thank you.
It seems like it depends on where it is. That's
always
seems to be the universal answer to these issues.
Yeah,
It's-
the answer to everything is it depends, and
It
when you do
depends.
this, yeah.
My mom used to say that.
I mean, the point is, we need to recognize the neighboring community in attributing those extra percent. I said 20% as an example, but I believe that we just cannot give a mathematical formula and added incentive to say, okay, if you fit those three criteria, you got plus 72%. There needs to be a community process as part of it. That was basically my only point.
Understood,
Well,
thank
isn't
you.
that part of the process in the next section, you know, continue to encourage a community workshop for PRD development, you know, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, doesn't density also, I mean, to me, especially based on some conversations that I've had with people about Stonebridge, it's the stakeholders there include not just the neighbors, but also the school system. When you're talking about a large-scale development, density, you have to look at demographic data to determine, we're talking about unit numbers, but how many people are going to occupy those units and how many
How many
kids are going to
children?
be in those units? Because impact, you extrapolate from that, the impact on the district. And I think we, so density is relative. We're talking just mathematically about, how many buildings you want to put on a certain number of acres plus a 10 or 20% increase. But that 10 or 20% increase
Well,
be the difference maker for
Is it-
impact.
isn't that what the definition of an impact fee is?
It does work with, and it takes into account that very thing in terms of the occupants in the household and what school, using formulas to determine the number of school-age children and push out a
Impact on
number.
parks
Yeah,
and-
project the impact financially, at least to some degree. And there's been additional studies that have been done examining developments where an impact, economic impact, taxing district impact, which includes the schools, the park district, to Trustee Brion's point about, what is the impact? And that's something that's been done over time. So, but those things do get analyzed.
Right. Because usership in a park district and attendance at a school are similar but quite different.
Yeah,
And so, that's why an age-restricted development, then it's a moot point, more or less. But if it's not, it's a very real point. So I think it might just be, again, it depends on the development. It would be hard to create I know there's got to be a ceiling, though. If we have a floor, there has to be a ceiling. I don't think that number would be hard to reach. I really don't. Because I think we can say right now what we know we could do on the largest piece of property we have, and then everything, you back into numbers.
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, Barbara, if I may.
Yes.
We've spent a lot of time talking about density from a theoretical or philosophical perspective. And from my perspective, I'm very, very concerned about the neighbors, and always have been whenever it comes to new development or density or whatever. And I'm wondering if perhaps one of the approaches should be look at a development that's been successful. And I think there's a general consensus that Armor Woods has been a successful development. I'm not sure what the density is per acre, but I get a little bit frightened when we're talking about tremendous increases in relative density and the considerable adverse impact it might have on that neighborhood who's relied upon what's been there for many, many years. And I don't want to lose sight of that, because I think some of the impacts have been generational that we've had in town, or almost generational. So I'm not sure if we could use Armor Woods as a template, but it seems like it was a successful endeavor.
Yeah, I agree with that, too.
Again, are we going to talk about, we're kind of getting to the end of our timeframe, and I want to be sure that we get to the section 10-5J-4, because there are some recommendations that were included that we want to talk about.
So in the interest of moving on and trying to hit our timeframe, let me say that what I've heard from the group is that tying density to the underlying zoning is really not where we're at, because it doesn't provide adequate flexibility. Rezoning to get to use the underlying zoning is perhaps a bit too aggressive, because it may provide right for units beyond where the village is comfortable. But to the extent that something can be established that sets an in-between, where more than the underlying zoning is possible, but there's some sort of upside to it to provide confidence to the neighbors and for all of you, and to the developer as well, so they know, look, this is my upside. That finding that sweet spot in there is my homework. Okay, I'm seeing nods, and without objection,
Yeah.
let's leave it at that.
Great, thank you. And on to the next.
On to the next one. And by the way, for what it's worth, I appreciate the conversation. This is all of us learning a lot more about where we're going. The comments and the insights are great. Can we, let's go back and try and finish some of the ones that are here. Let me at least introduce them. Can you go back a slide? Let's at least introduce these, and if we don't want to spend a lot of time on them, that's fine. So the sister concern to density is always height, right? And so I like to work from known figures, right? Because there's comfort to it, there's consistency, and 44 feet is the max height that exists in the code now. So that's why it's in here. Again, this would be something that could be varied, especially if we're going to look at allowing a multifamily development. That 44 might be a little higher for that unit. But in terms of single family, 44 is the tallest building you can have now in town. Is that perhaps appropriate for single family units in a PRD?
Depends on the underlying zoning.
I'm sorry?
I think it depends on the underlying zoning and the location, right? I mean, just like all of these. I mean, to have a PRD in the middle of a single-family neighborhood, not that is likely, but to allow 44 feet and multifamily, and
That's a lot.
That's kind of high.
Okay.
To have it somewhere else, I think it could totally be done, and it could be even higher. So I'd be uncomfortable putting a limit in because it depends. And
So-
it always depends.
So maybe to kind of pick up on that is, maybe the instruction here is similar to the question of density, which is it depends on the base plus, right? There is the base zoning is instructive, but not absolutely, but not absolute, given if you can show the benefit of something else. So if the base zoning is 34, right, and you're going to do a development that's got peaked roofs or something, and you need to do 36 or 37, that would be a reason to do it.
And to the common concept of it depends, right? And to Chair Peters' concept of let's look out for the neighborhood, it's not uncommon in zoning to talk about like touching like, right? So something
Yeah.
is tall, touching tall, and something, so that scale, all that matters when it's adjacent to something that could be equally as tall, right? Then it's maybe more, the transition seems palatable, right?
And I would suggest to you that exactly what you're describing, Gru, is sort of inherent in the PRD process, but what I'm hearing from the group is we'd like a little bit more of that context spelled out in the code so that it's not as broad a discussion, that there's maybe a little bit more focused parameters on it.
And it also communicates to the development community certainty.
Yes.
To the degree that it can, because that's always a concern from the development community.
Well, a height restriction should be based, I think that's what we're talking about, on what the rest of that neighborhood is. The whole thing with Block 3 was it was too tall.
Yep.
And there's nothing in that neighborhood, that specific area, that was that tall, though there were some single-family homes that probably approached it if you took the peak of the roof. So it's not only height, it's mass. And I think it has to be neighborhood specific if we're going to put it into any kind of code or PRD. So in my mind, if you say have 44 feet maximum, but you have to put an addendum based on the surrounding neighborhood.
Okay.
I think that's real important.
Which goes right to the next one about setback, right? Bulk changes. A 40-foot building is a lot different when it's 300 feet back on a lot versus 30 feet back, right? Yeah.
And since we're so space is such a difficult in this community, I think the zoning has to be very specific based on the neighborhood.
I hear what you're saying, and we can do that. We can do that.
Yeah, that goes back to Highland Park. They have downtown developments, mixed-use developments, Skokie Highway Business District developments. So they really set it out.
And keep in mind, that PUD is applicable to all types of development. They don't have a PRD
Right.
just for
But
residential,
using
so
that
that's why they
sort of
do
as a
that.
guidepost, like, because again, I think that that's such a great point, that what works, and Aaron's right, what works here is very different from what we would say would work. If I'm reimagining the business park to hopefully see it become more of a revenue generator for us, because I think it's lagging. So if we were to say, let's build an apartment building, no one is going to say 44 feet is the limit. So if we start to think in terms of how different that is from here, and we parse that out, we could really do ourselves a big favor, because right now, no one knows that we would say yes to anything out there. They're under the impression we might say no. And we have to bifurcate the village, because it is in fact divided that way. That use out there could be so, it's limitless, really.
Let me try and run through some of these quickly, and I don't want to shortchange it, and if it's your direction that we go a little longer or have another meeting, or I do some more analysis and get back to you, whatever works for the group, I'll do. But let me start with 6 and 7 in terms of open space. Open space right now is defined as this 30-foot perimeter around the PUD, around the PRD. That logic, I don't know where 30 feet came from, but that logic I can understand. It's, let's keep some distance between the neighbors and what we're developing here. That's a straightforward and logical idea. But there are areas where the 30 feet is not going to make sense. If you're, the example that Drew used was great. If you're next to a forest preserve, why do you need to have a 30-foot buffer up against a forest preserve? If there's an opportunity to actually integrate with a road network and as part of a current neighborhood, right? Why would you want to be 30 feet away? So this 30 feet perimeter is not going to work. Now, there might be areas where it's appropriate, and that's kind of what the recommendation is that it be applied only where it's appropriate, or that the perimeter be applied. But the other question that begs is, well, what is the open space? Right? And there's interior open space that is part of this as well. So what is the inside? So the idea is not that we're going to take the perimeter open space and ignore it, but we're going to add it to the inside, and we're going to have areas. Again, it's about creating space. It's part of the PRD idea. You see it in a lot of different ways. You even see it in Tangley Oaks and the other developments in town. And frankly, I pulled the 20% out of the Highland Park Code because I'm familiar with it, and I've applied it, and I've seen it work. It can be more, it can be less. If it's more, it starts to be very demanding. It could be less, quite honestly. But again, it all depends on how you define it, right? So there are some codes that say, oh, well, even the setbacks to the building are open space. I generally stay away from that because that's a private area, not a public area. But again, we can talk about numbers, but what would be good is if we could agree on the concept of only using the perimeter open space where it's necessary to create a separation, but that there be some common open space in the interior of the development that's to the benefit of those that are going to live there and other members of the community that might be visiting or take advantage of it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's a park, by the way, right? It could be a passive area. There might be a wetland in the middle of the development. That counts, right? It's about creating a more open feel. So we'll talk about the numbers further.
I just had a quick question, I'm sorry.
Please.
I know we're tight on time. Would if we move the open space into the interior, is it still open to anyone in the community, or then does it just become open space for the neighborhood? Like, I would look at perimeter space and think maybe that's more open to everyone in the community versus interior space would be specific just for that neighborhood.
But for the development being a gated community, it's for everybody. And the other thing is it's not necessarily a park or a recreation area, right? It might just be, it could be a boulevard. If you install a boulevard, that could count. If you preserve a wetland, or if you don't, it might be a floodplain area, right? So it's not necessarily a recreational amenity. It's quite literally what it says, it's an open space. This next one that's in here about requiring a public benefit is something that I would recommend to you. This is common in planned developments, that there is some benefit that is provided to the community as part of the development. And my experience, including in Highland Park, has been that this is either additional open space above and beyond what's provided. It's some landscaped area. It might be taking the private area or the a private recreation area and making it public. But there's something that's part of the process that provides benefit to the community. Some codes spell it out, some codes don't. They leave it wide open. But the idea that there is something that is pointed to that is providing benefit to the community And again, not necessarily the community overall, to your question about is it for the community overall? It may well be, but it's probably more focused in the area around the development.
I think that's all fine and good, but if we're talking about a two-lot, or two-home
Yeah.
lot, PRD, having a public benefit is really not in the cards for something like that. So that may be where you'd want to have more specificity as to the size of the PRD or the size of the development should require a public benefit, should require an open space, and so forth.
Or should it can be waived for PRDs under X number of units or X number of acres, or, can be waived, something like that.
And what's a public benefit? I mean, we've been talking about our community needs condos. Is that a public benefit for somebody to come in and build condos? I mean, I think it is, because we need that type of housing. Right, that's what I'm asking. Is that what it means, or does it have to be a park, or?
No, it could absolutely be a type of development that is predefined in the code that is something of benefit. And there's a slide in here that lists a bunch of incentives. These could also specifically be items that could be accepted as public benefit. Madam President Pro Tem, yeah.
There's way too many words there. So do you advise then that we try to put together a list that would be specific examples that may fit that criteria, not to be exhaustive, but to give some type of guideline?
Yeah, and if you look through the 2 pages back in
Yeah.
the presentation, has got a list of
Yeah.
things that frankly came up either as review, thank you, Glenn, either as review of public policy, the things you've been doing now. These would all be things that could be accepted as public benefit. And quite frankly, if we're going to go through the process of otherwise providing increased potential for density, this might become the list of acceptable public benefits.
Yeah.
But then would we require it of all PRDs, or just require it for getting additional density? Or other zoning?
I think it'd be required of POD of a specific size and a specific nature. I agree with the point that if it's a 2-unit PRD that's on a 3/4 or acre lot, yeah, requiring historic preservation, is not going to work. So, yeah, there would have to be a threshold at which it kicked in.
But I think we covered that a little bit when you made the suggestion you have a shall and a may. And so right now, all of this language that we're going over with question marks is predicated on a 6-acre minimum. So the reason it doesn't make much sense about talking about a wetland in the middle of a development is because on a 1/2 acre, that wouldn't make any sense. I mean, I'm on a 1/2 acre lot almost, so nobody's gonna do that.
So then that speaks to looking at which ones should be required regardless, and which ones should be incentivized.
Right, so you just asterisk required for X acreage and above. I mean, if to Elliot's point earlier, if you're just building 2 houses on 3 acres, you may be able, you could have a wetlands in there, but I think it's true, public implies access sometimes. Benefit implies something else. So when you put those 2 words together, you can come up with a really exhaustive list that's both sort of what we've talked about before in terms of access to space, like Tangley with the walking paths, versus benefit to the community as a whole, which could be additional property taxes. I mean, at that point, you're just going off on a forever list of things.
If I may.
Yes, please.
You've answered some of these other questions as we've gone through and done the discussion. And on the slide that we had about standards, there's really just a couple of things that I'd like to know about. If we have 10 more minutes,
Sure.
or if you'd rather do this another time, I defer to the group. But I would like to hear what is the sense of the group in terms of the notions of site plan and architectural review that are in here. These are a way to kind of get at some of those middle ground questions, and if we could share some thoughts on that. I think the other questions that are here and on the next slide, which you can look at, kind of answer themselves, and I'm glad to just discuss those when we come back with a draft of this for you, and certainly something I'll work on with staff and council. So if we have another 10 minutes in us, and if I could briefly explain what's intended here with this site plan review and architectural review,
Are there any objections to continuing? Okay, thank you. Let's continue. Let's press ahead.
And thank you all very much, appreciate it. And again, an outstanding discussion and just what we needed to move forward. And it's scary putting all these numbers in here and giving them to you, because it's about what you want the code to be more than the numbers that we put in. So this has been very instructive, so thank you. But these ideas of architectural and site plan review, there are versions of this in the code now, right? So the village does this now, which, as I said before, I always like because there's familiarity, there's comfort with it. But what we're suggesting here is that it be a little bit different. Site plan review, as suggested here and is used in a lot of communities, is a chance to take what may come before staff as kind of D or C minus work and get it to be a B plus before it comes to the PCZBA, right? Because staff knows well what is in the code, staff knows well what the PCZBA and Village Board have looked for, and it's a chance to work with the applicant to say, look, you know what, the way you've got this cul-de-sac set up, the way you've got, these are not specifically spelled out height kind of things. These are about good design and good development. And I always go back to a case that I saw, frankly, again, while I was in Highland Park, somebody brought us a development with just a terrible, and we didn't think safe, flow in the drive-throughs with the traffic. Not the drive-throughs, but just the traffic on the development. We had no hammer to say, you can't do this, because it was a by right development, right? A site plan review process is to go, no, this isn't safe, this isn't right. This may work for you, and it might make good use of the land you've got, but it's not safe, you have to do better, right? And so that's what this process would have staff doing before you all come to it, and then add more to it. That's not the final say on it, but it's a requirement that they're, like I said, the D work, which you might get, you'd be surprised the stuff that Glenn and Drew gets shown, but it's a chance for them to bring something closer to what it should be before it goes through this entire process that we've talked about.
So what you're talking about is basically looking down on the land and saying what's going to be where, you know, where are the pieces basically going to be laid out? What's the flow of vehicles, people, buildings, all that type of
Right.
stuff. So just making that, instead of at the final point of review, as part of one of those initial phases, so that we can kind of,
Yes.
yeah, well, it sounds,
It would not negate or diminish any of the review that the PCZBA does or that the village board ultimately does, but it would empower staff to say, look, you know what, you got to at least do this, this, and this. And if somebody goes, no, I'm not going to do that, well, then it ultimately becomes for the PCZBA to consider that point and for the board to approve it. But this notion of an administrative site plan review is something that we recommend in a lot of codes. And again, it's to the benefit of the village, but it's also to the benefit of the applicant, because they're finding out early on if they're close.
yes,
I like that idea.
yes. George, do you have any thoughts on this?
George is.
You're on mute right now, I'm sorry to say. There we go.
We've done it unofficially for many developments. It's not that the developer comes in and takes his plan right to the PCZBA. It's very often asked, and it's a great idea to formalize it.
I think that's a good point. It essentially codifies what you want to do. But again, having been a community development director, I've been in the position where the developer goes, no, don't want to do it. And there are things that should be required, so it's a chance to do that.
So it's a chance to kind of clean up what is going to be done as part of the process. It's not punitive to any one developer, and it kind of helps everyone scoot the process along.
Can I ask who's responsible for the cost of that site visit or that analysis?
Of that review process?
Yeah.
It's a great question. So assuming that it's done as part of the process, I mean, as Member Russell was saying, it's something that the staff has been doing and does typically. So it's part of the application process. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of extra work. If you get to a point where there are third-party reviewers involved, they have third-party reimbursement. So if it gets to the point where we need the traffic engineer to look at it, or we need a forester to look at it, or something like that, that cost would be borne by the applicant.
Any other comments? Jill?
I was just gonna say, I think sometimes our details seem to happen later for a lot of the developers. Like
Yeah.
we ask for them to do not detailed, and the public opinion comes early. And right? And
Yeah.
so it
Yeah.
seems that how we can do more workshops to perhaps, I really feel strongly that the Architectural Review Board and the PCZBA should jointly be in these workshops together to make sure that we have those standards of materials and height and all those things that we can jointly communicate. A lot of communities are doing that. Sacramento, West Coast, they're all joining forces together to make a better outcome. And we talk about that word flexibility, and yet if we can't be flexible at that point, it's a rude point moving forward. So I really think that, we talk about all these numbers and let's calculate, but if the numbers aren't right financially incentive for a developer, and also if we don't force something to be right for the community. So anyway, I think that's the issue of the workshops. I jumped ahead a little bit, but I know you're getting there about doing the joint meetings and everything. I think that's a really important part.
And we'll, if we can talk about it now if you want, but we can talk about that at the next level too. But yeah, I think the idea of the joint meeting is worthwhile, and whether or not that's the pre-app or some other aspect of it, that's flexible. That's not, doesn't need to be decided right now. The idea of architectural review, again, something that you're doing now. The suggestion here is that in terms of the PRD, that it be made a little bit more specific. The current code says the plan should go to the Architectural Board of Review, but there's really no standard in terms of what they're looking for. That's not really fair to that group to say, tell us what you think. And what this draft is suggesting, or what this recommendation is suggesting, is that we identify some standards by which they're making that determination as to whether or not it's fine. You wouldn't have them look at a custom-built home. I'm not going to recommend that you get into architectural review of individual homes. But to the extent that there are going to be multifamily buildings or even townhome buildings, if there are going to be common buildings and there's going to be common area landscaping, right? There are parts of the development that the process and the expertise and experience of that body will add value to that. And that's what we're suggesting here. Not that and again, the step is already in here. So we're not adding a step, which I think is important too. It's not like we're adding something. We're just adding structure to that step. And if I'll invite you, if you look at some of the things that are in there in terms of the details that we've talked about, if those things seem out of whack, or you'd like to see more of something, I'd ask that you email staff and they'll pass it along.
So you're referring to the more detailed, 9-page summary, that type of, am I correct?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch all of that.
I'm trying to, when you say in your page 9, the architectural review, a requirement for architectural review to be conducted by the ABR is recommended for the PRD process. The current code has provisions for architectural design review. It is applied to the PCD, PMO, et cetera.
Right. So if you look at the bottom of 9 and top of 10.
Exactly.
Those are the items I'm talking about. And again, some of those things have already been in the process of being discussed and worked through with the village already.
Right.
So that's what I would ask that you take a look at, and if those things seem logical, great. If you think some of them are not appropriate for the village, or you'd like to add some, please share that.
That's what I meant. I just referred to that specific list.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. And if there's more questions about it, we'll start to fill that in if there's more questions about it. we can certainly do that. The next slide talks about process, and I've used my 10 minutes. All I would say about process on this slide here is that you already do this process of a community workshop, and I would suggest keeping that. This idea of the pre-application meeting is in there as an option. It's a great idea, and I'm open to how you would want to do it. Some towns do it differently, but the idea of having some pre-app that gives the applicant an idea of what's in store is better for everybody involved, quite honestly.
And just to put a finer point on it, the who does it, in some towns, for text amendments to the zoning code or for developments, the village board can be the first look versus the PCZBA or the PCZBA and the ABR. That's done quite commonly. So it's another approach.
There's no right answer, and we can talk about both, and this is the recommendation that's in here now, but it's certainly something that I'm flexible on, absolutely, and we can talk about more at the next step. And the only other thing here is to go back to what I repeated what I said earlier, is that the PRD is most appropriately a form of a special use. So you'll know from being familiar with special uses that there's more of a border around a special use in terms of the timing and the process. And so all of those would become applied to the PRD process in terms of how long it was valid until work was done and so on and so forth. And there's some technical aspects to the timing too that we'll deal with, but just wanted to point that out. And then the next slide we already talked about, so we'll use these as options for public benefit, and I would suggest the same thing. If you have got any other ideas that you think would be appropriate public benefit, or you think these aren't, I think guest parking comes out of here, there's a couple other, but if there's any that you specifically have thoughts on for, against, or would like to add, please share those with staff, and they'll send them to me. I apologize for rattling through this as quickly as I can possibly talk with this blessed mask on.
Everybody knows what complete streets are? You want to describe what complete streets policy? The village has one, but.
Yeah, the village has a complete streets policy. The idea of complete streets is that streets are not just for cars, most simply put, right? Streets are also for bicyclists. Actually, the designers in our, you know Jody. Jody designs shared streets where there's no curb, and it's really, the street is part of everybody's space. Now, you can't do this everywhere. You see it in Europe much more commonly than you do here in the States. But the idea is to let drivers know that the streets are not just about them.
Why don't we add age-appropriate housing? That seems to be the goal of it.
Excellent, thank you. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your insights. I thank you for reading 13 pages of zoning and for the extra 15 minutes. What we'll do is we'll start to turn this into zoning language. I'm kind of thinking out loud here. Maybe what we'll do before that is summarize what we talked about tonight and get that back to you, so that you can let us know that we're going in the right direction, or if you rethink anything or discuss it in an upcoming meeting. If you think we need to have another discussion like this, it's certainly part of our program to come back and have this discussion again, but I think I'm probably the only one in the room who likes standing up and talking about zoning nonstop, so.
Before we let you go, Glenn, did you have notice of anyone who is looking in online and seeing that they would like to participate in some way?
I'm not seeing anyone, Madam President Pro Tem.
Great, we don't want to ignore anybody who might be with us online. All right, so we want to thank you for this presentation, the slideshow, the detailed memorandum, the guidance as we kind of floundered from topic to topic and kind of went off track sometimes, so thank you.
It's very useful, and you all understand this well and have shared a lot, and I appreciate your time.
And I appreciate the PCZBA joining us and, spending all this time talking about very important issues, and hopefully we can continue the discussion. Member Miller?
I'd like to thank the board for joining the PCZBA in their
I know, we took over the seat, and it was just,
But we
it
want
was,
our seats back.
yeah. I will gladly vacate. I don't know, do we need an actual motion to conclude this? To adjourn? Do we have a motion to adjourn our meeting?
So moved.
So, okay, so moved by member Ryder, or trustee Ryder, and seconded by trustee Markey. Do we have a roll call vote for this? A voice vote, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, it passes. Good night.
Good night. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.